This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 196 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we will be exploring 4 models for using blended learning in your classroom. Once upon a time, the content of a formal education came to students through one of 2 pathways. They either listened to it in a teacher's lecture or they read it in books. Now, technology has opened up more pathways. Students can read online articles, watch videos, participate in digital simulations, and do interactive lessons at whatever time and pace works for them. While teachers are freed up to do more one-on-one work with students, like conferencing, assessment, and small group instruction. This weaving together of technology-based and face-to-face instruction is most often referred to as blended learning. And if a teacher can get that weaving process right, it can result in far more personalized learning for students and much more satisfying work for teachers. But that's the key, getting the weaving process right. Because if you don't have a good plan for blended learning, you can end up wasting time and creating frustration for yourself and your students. And that is where today's guest, Catlin Tucker, can help. For quite a few years, every time I wanted to send a teacher some resources about blended learning, my go-to was Catlin Tucker. Through her blog, Tucker had regularly shared how she had restructured her teaching so that she no longer took work home at night or on weekends, keeping all of the instruction in her high school English classroom. She did this through stations in which students worked sometimes in groups, sometimes independently, and sometimes directly with her. Having been an English teacher myself, I was fascinated by her process because it would have made my own work far more sustainable in the classroom. Since then, Tucker has written a handful of books on blended learning, and when I saw that she had a new one called The Complete Guide to Blended Learning, it seemed like the perfect time to have her on the podcast to share some of what she knows. In the book, Tucker explains exactly what blended learning is. She lays out a convincing argument for why teachers should give it a serious try, and she shows readers step by step how to implement a plan that works. Today, she's going to share with us a small slice of the book, walking us through 4 different models for structuring blended learning in your classroom. This is the weaving process in action, blueprints for how exactly to blend technology-based learning with face-to-face learning. By the time you're done listening, you should have at least one idea for how you can organize a class period, a full week, or even a whole unit of instruction with blended learning. Catlin has written a detailed blog post over on our site that explores each of these 4 models. So if you want to see it as well as listen to it, come over to Cult of Pedagogy, go to the podcast page, and click on episode 196. Before we get started with the interview, I would like to thank Coder Z for sponsoring this episode. Coder Z is a gamified coding platform combining STEM, computer science, and critical life skills. With a standards-aligned, award-winning curriculum, Coder Z eliminates fear through meaningful support and preparation of educators by implementing fun, flexible, and engaging instruction in a real-world context. Through the power of virtual robotics, students in 4th grade and beyond use computational thinking to overcome obstacles, show off their skills on a global scale, and embrace failure as a part of learning. With Coder Z, educators open pathways for students inspired and motivated to discover their future. It's built for everyone from the tech nerd to the computer shy. Visit cultofpedagogy.com/coderz, that's CODERZ, to bring coding to your classroom today. Support also comes from Studio. Today, by Studio, is a planning tool which allows students to track and plan all of their classwork by estimating how much time a task will take and dividing larger tasks into smaller steps. Teachers can track how each student is handling their workload over time. This is a valuable tool to support parent conversations and help each student plan their work and pace themselves. Coaching students on better organization has a direct impact on their grades as well as their long-term success. Today offers a free plan for individual students and parents to enter their own tasks. Schoolwork from Google Classroom can be automatically imported via an inexpensive subscription, And school and district plans come with added features like timetable import, workload management, and more LMS integrations. Visit studio.co/pedagogy to create your free account now and get your students planning. That's studio.co, studio.co/pedagogy. Now here's my interview with Catlin Tucker about blended learning. Catlin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have you. We've just a second ago, we're talking about how long we've been following each other's work, and I've been wanting to have you on for a really long time. And I saw that you have a new book on blended learning, and so I thought we need to do this right now. So just tell my listeners, if they don't happen to know who you are in education and what you are when it comes to like blended learning.
Sure. So I spent 16 years in a high school English language arts classroom. About 5 years in, really disillusioned with the teaching profession. And that's where I ended up integrating online components into my class after teaching some online courses during my maternity leaves with my children. And it was really the impact of that on my students' engagement that got me excited about blended learning. And then I just fumbled my way through it for probably the better part of 5 years. And in that time was just so excited about the potential of engaging kids both on and offline. I've worked as a blended learning coach. I've written a bunch of books on blended learning, and I did my doctoral research in this space as well. And now I have the privilege of getting to work with people who are hoping to become teachers.
Nice. And yeah, I remember when I first sort of found you doing blended learning, you were still an English teacher and you were sort of determined to not bring work home. And
Yes.
As a former English teacher myself, I thought that's basically the reason I never went back to the classroom, because I thought I have 3 kids. There's no way that I can keep up that workload at home. I don't know how to do it. So I just never tried.
Yeah.
So I was always really impressed that you pulled that off. Yeah. So let's just start with, I have a feeling a lot of people have a pretty good sense of what blended learning is, but let's get a definition as you prefer to define blended learning.
Yeah. I do think the phrase has been used a lot in the last few years and maybe not always anchored to clear definitions. So how I define it is active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline, with the goal of giving students more control over their learning experience, specifically time, place, pace, and or path. So they're not going to control all of those things all the time, but the goal of the different models, and they're, blended learning is kind of like an umbrella phrase. Within the umbrella are lots of different ways to combine this online and offline learning, and different models give them different degrees of control over those 4 elements of their learning. So it's kind of a spin on the Horn and Staker 2012 definition that's very much kind of from a constructivist perspective, because the most important part of that definition from my perspective really is the active engagement piece. How are we using this combination to really position the learner at the center of the experience?
Okay. And, we had gone, you've written a blog post that's going to accompany this interview. And one of the things that you and I kind of went back and forth about a little bit is this definition. And you had said that you wanted to make sure that the definition isn't just using video for learning, which I think that is if you wanted to make it an extremely basic, because I remember when I first started hearing blended learning, it was contrasting it with flipped learning. First, there was flipped learning, and then I started hearing about basically bringing that flipped stuff into the classroom and having, instead of like watching a video at home and then doing something active in the classroom, you could have the video access in the room at the same time too. So if you can just talk a little bit about this, maybe an oversimplification of the definition.
Well, I actually think that where this comes from is flipped classroom is a blended learning model. So using video strategically in that way very much falls within the umbrella. And I think thanks to Saul Khan and the Khan Academy exploding when it did, everybody got really comfortable and familiar with flipped classroom. And it was really clean and simple. It made sense to folks. And then I remember when I wrote my first book, it was like 2011, and people would ask, what's it about? And I'm like, blended learning. Nobody had heard of that phrase in the K-12 space, really. But I would say something like, have you heard of flipped classroom? And they'd say yes. And I was like, okay, well, blended learning is kind of the bigger umbrella. That's just one model within the umbrella that is blended learning, or within this kind of taxonomy of blended learning models. So I think, and don't get me wrong, like video is so incredibly helpful, and it really does show up in lots of the different models, from station rotation to playlist model, allowing students that self-pacing opportunity and really freeing teachers from the front of the room. I just hate to simplify blended learning and have people think, oh, it's just video instruction, when it actually can be so much more.
Right. So tell me if this sounds right as just another way, because I really want to make sure that anybody listening is sort of like on the same page with us. Instead of the teacher being in charge of the pacing and the instruction all the way through, blended learning takes chunks of that and puts it in the student's hands in terms of where they access it, how often they access it, and what they do with those things, as opposed to it always being the teacher actively delivering the instruction to the students.
Yes. Ideally, we are positioning the students to have more of that control.
Okay. So what we're going to do in a few minutes is, because you've got a new book on blended learning, and tell me again, what is the title of it? The Complete
Guide.
Right. And in that book, you've got 4 models, 4 different ways of sort of structuring all of this stuff so that teachers have options. So we're going to go through those in a little while. But I guess before we do, we're going to just have you talk a little bit about, why is blended learning a good thing? Why would people want to try it? And then you've also got some sort of pain points that it tends to solve, some of the major pain points of teaching that blended learning actually solves. So we're going to sell it a little bit before we present the model. So why would teachers try this?
Yes. Well, and I think that's important, because whenever we're asking teachers to do anything new, right, it takes time, energy, it's outside their comfort zone. It's like there has to be some kind of incentive to want to do that. And from a really basic perspective, when I talk to teachers, I start by just identifying these 2 realities in education that are never going to change. And you know how much change there is in education. You can't say that about a bunch of stuff. But one, we know there will always be learner variability. Kids are just different from each other in terms of their skills, their needs, their language preferences, or their language proficiencies, their learning preferences, their backgrounds. And so as we start to really just acknowledge that reality, it makes sense to start to question, why would we use a single experience to try to meet such diversity of need in a class? The second is, like it or not, technology is not going anywhere. And I would really love for educators to be thinking about, what would they like technology to do in these rooms, right? I don't want kids sitting in front of screens, passively consuming information all the time, which is part of my concern about the video instruction, right? Because it's really easy to slip into that passive consumptive role. And instead think about, okay, technology's permeated all of these aspects of our lives. It's going to play a role here in these classrooms. What do we want that to be? And hopefully we're using technology to put students kind of at the center of the experience, allowing them more agency and kind of control over their learning. So for me, that's kind of the fundamental, why is this worth our time and energy? Because if we truly want learning to be inclusive and accessible and equitable, we need to start thinking about different models that allow us to get closer to meeting that diversity of need. Right. But I also think it can address some really challenging pain points that make this career hard.
Let's get into those. So you've got 3 really clearly identified pain points that are just endemic to teaching, and blended learning addresses these. So what's the first one?
Yeah, and I tie these to kind of what I consider as like pillars of high quality blended learning. So the first pain point is really teachers perceiving that there's really low levels of engagement, low levels of motivation in the classroom. And that's really frustrating, because we're doing our best to create these learning experiences we hope will excite kids. But one of the things that I think is important to recognize is we have students who spend all day in classrooms who don't make a single choice about what they learn, how they learn, what they create to demonstrate their learning. And over time, that's a really powerless position. And what we know about human motivation is we need a degree of autonomy and agency to be motivated. And so one of the pillars of blended learning really is this focus on student agency and giving students meaningful choices about their learning experience. Over time, those choices can have a really positive impact on student engagement, and student engagement and teacher engagement are reciprocal. So when student engagement goes up, it positively impacts teacher engagement. So as As much as it almost seems like teachers want to clamp and take more control when students aren't kind of doing what they want them to do, or, the kids aren't really doing what we would love to see them doing in classrooms, the opposite might actually be more effective, which is, where do I give these students choice so that hopefully they are excited to lean into the learning experiences?
Got it. So the models that you're going to be sharing, we can sort of show places where some of those choices happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what's the second pain point?
So the second pain point is really just about how daunting it is to meet that diversity of need in a classroom as a single teacher, right? It almost feels like, from my perspective, every year in education, the spectrum of need in a classroom just gets wider and wider and wider. And teachers know differentiation is important. They want to differentiate. But within that whole group teacher-led model, where teachers are spending a lot of time at the front of the room kind of guiding the experience, it can be very challenging to work with individual or small groups of learners, kind of adjusting the supports and scaffolds, thinking about what are these students ready for in terms of kind of the level of academic rigor and complexity in terms of practice and application I'm asking them to do. And so when we think about these models, they really are designed to free teachers from that front of the room, that whole group dynamic, and allow them more opportunities to sit with individual learners, pairs, small groups, to more effectively and consistently differentiate. So it can definitely help teachers feel more effective. And we can talk about what that looks like in some of these models too.
Right. Okay. And then the third one.
The third is classroom management and unproductive behaviors, which the last 2 years have been incredibly challenging on that score. I mean, it's always an issue, I think, for a lot of teachers. They just kind of struggle with it. And there's a myriad reasons why kids last year were really struggling, right? Acclimating back into these academic settings. But a lot of unproductive behaviors and management issues actually blossom from like this misalignment between the pace at which the learning is moving and the pace at which the individual learners need it to move. So when it's moving too fast, they get frustrated, they might not feel valued, they disengage. It's moving too slow, they get bored, they make their own fun, they disengage. So as architects of learning experiences, when we're designing these lessons, like, where are those moments in an experience where a student can have a higher degree of control over the pace at which they consume information, right? That's why video and podcasts and digital articles are so helpful. And also the pace at which they kind of navigate multi-step tasks, so they hopefully stay more engaged in the experience. Right. So really, those are the three pillars of, like, when I think of high quality blended learning, it's like, are we thinking student agency, differentiation, control over pace? Because I think they have real benefits for teachers and learners.
And, before we move into the models, I think it's probably pretty important to address what might be on the minds of some people right now who may be thinking, look, when COVID hit and we all went remote, I did blended learning and it didn't work. And my thinking is that they thought they were doing blended learning, but there were some important components that were off. And so this is an opportunity to make a couple of changes that would be very significant in making it work better.
Absolutely. Like, I know teachers who, just because of being on a video conference, they were like, well, this is blended learning because part of it's online. Kids are doing some stuff offline in their remote environment. But did they have any control over that experience? Maybe not.
Right. Okay. So you've got these 4 models. And so I'm basically going to just let you talk and I'll prompt you with some questions. And so, let's hear this first one.
Okay, so we'll start with station rotation model. And the reason we're focused on 4, because there are more models than this, and I actually think the taxonomy of blended learning models is going to continue to kind of change and develop over time, which is great, that flexibility. But these 4 are the rotation, kind of fall in the rotation models. And what I love about them, and I would love to see this be a selling point for teachers thinking about investing time and energy, is they work beautifully entirely in a physical classroom. What I found in COVID is they worked beautifully entirely online with offline learning components in remote home settings. And it works when you're on a hybrid schedule and you have this beautiful blend of the two. And so one of the things I tell teachers is these models are flexible enough that no matter what teaching and learning landscape you're in, you can use them and hopefully use them to feel a lot more effective at engaging learners. So Station rotation model really does exactly what the name suggests. There are a series of stations or learning activities, which is kind of how we had to think of it during COVID, because I was helping teachers run virtual station rotations,
Mm-hmm.
and students move through them. That can be on a teacher pacing. It can be self-pacing as well. And the idea is that there's a teacher-led station where teachers can dedicate their time to differentiated small group instruction, interactive modeling sessions, guided practice, real-time feedback, teacher-facilitated discussions. I
Mm-hmm.
really don't want it to just be teachers moving from the front of the room talking at kids to now we're in a small group setting and I'm talking the whole time. I want it to be this opportunity for us to facilitate really dynamic and differentiated experiences with these small groups of learners.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have the online station or multiple stations and the offline station or multiple offline stations. And when I work with teachers, we really strive on trying to keep those elements balanced, right? Balancing the online with the offline, the individual with the collaborative. So the station rotation can, the different activities at the station can take lots of different forms, but the goal
Mm-hmm.
is to, at the online and offline stations, give students more control over pacing and path, but free the teacher to really run that small group experience.
And is that sort of, is it typically timed to where if you have, say, like a 90-minute block, you may have a 10-minute intro, 10-minute outro time or something like that, and then it's like maybe 20 minutes and you sort of signal to everybody it's time to switch, or do they move independently from station to, I'm assuming the teacher-led stations have to have some structure to them.
So it depends. If you
Okay.
are going to run like differentiated direct instruction, then absolutely. Like when I was on a 90-minute block, sometimes we would jump right in with very little
Oh,
intro or outro, and
okay.
we would do a 4 station, literally like 23-minute rotation. Sometimes it would be a 2-day, 6 station rotation. If I wanted kids to have almost 30 minutes in a station, but I had 6 stations to run over kind of 2 days. Now, if I'm using my teacher-led station for something like differentiated direct instruction or interactive modeling, where I do really need kind of a consistent amount of time to work with
Mm.
each group, then teacher pacing is the way to go. But if I'm going to use my teacher led for something a little bit more flexible and fluid, like, hey, we're in the middle of a lab report or a performance task, and you're going to come to my station and get some really quick, focused, actionable feedback, then my station can almost be like a drop-in station. So as
Mm.
students are self-pacing through, they don't have to be on my timeline. And it's so funny because sometimes high school teachers will tell me like, no, I don't think my students can handle a self-paced station rotation. And I'm like, I've seen first graders rock a self-paced station rotation. So it's absolutely doable. And they really enjoy the control over that pacing. It's so
Yeah.
interesting to watch.
It sounds like the kind of thing that you cannot just jump into and expect it to go well. It sounds like you need to have a lot of preparation, practice, setting of norms, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, in any blended lesson, because kids have more control, they do need a little bit of time to work on some of those
Yeah.
self-regulation skills. And
Right.
that just takes practice, routines, consistency.
I feel like that's the point where a lot of teachers decide this isn't working. I'm going back to the old way because they're just not willing to hang in there and work out the kinks, basically.
Yeah. Well, it's because like
Yeah.
you might have been teaching 5, 10, 15 years. You've got your
Yeah.
confidence and you try something new. It's like you're that first year teacher again. And when it doesn't go great,
Yeah.
because often it doesn't the first time around, it's easy to just say, oh, I'm not doing that again.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to real quick before we move to the next lesson, because I've got a chart here that you made. I'm going to read a couple of these things just as examples of things that can happen at these 3 stations. So at a teacher-led station, you've got the differentiated direct instruction, modeling, guided practice, some real-time feedback, like you were saying. Online, obviously, students can be consuming a video lesson or other sort of digital media, doing research online, personalized practice with adaptive software, online discussions. And then the offline stuff, they can be working in pairs on things, having discussions, doing some reading and writing on their own, working on makerspace stuff. So there really is a variety. And over on the blog post, people are going to have access to all of these examples so they can picture it, the kinds of activities that could be in those stations.
Yeah. The sky's the
Um,
limit.
yeah. Okay. So what's the second model?
So the second model is the whole group rotation. And the whole group rotation is really just rotating the whole group or the whole class between online, offline learning activities. And originally, if you look at the original taxonomy, this was called like the lab rotation. The idea being that kids were going to have to do the offline learning in a classroom, rotate into a computer lab for the online learning portion. We don't really need to do that anymore because of Chromebooks and one-to-one initiatives. But the real goal, if we're going to utilize this one well, is to be thinking very intentionally about what learning landscape and what mode is going to work best. Like, would this work best online or offline? Or would it be good to give students a choice between whether they'd like to do something online or offline? And when kids are in the offline mode or in the online mode, how is the teacher using that time? Are they pulling individual learners? Are they running some kind of reteaching support groups with a few students who need more assistance or need to go back over additional models? And so that it's really, for me, sometimes the whole group rotation is easier to onboard like secondary teachers who are really used to spending a bit of time lecturing or running mini lessons, and blended learning feels like a big ask. But I think for them, it's really about that intentionality of like, where should I be engaging kids for these activities? What's going to be most effective? And then if I have these online moments, can I create personalized paths with adaptive software, online activities, and then use my teacher time to really connect with learners? So that one for me, I used a lot less with my own students, but I do see it as a really helpful bridge for some secondary teachers that this feels like a big ask.
Okay. So everybody's kind of doing the same thing at the same time. They're in the same mode at the same time anyway.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. So the third model is the flipped classroom model.
Yes, which sometimes people will hear me say flipped classroom or flipped learning. And the only reason I'll say both is because I do think the connotation with flipped classroom is we're sending these videos home with kids, right? We're going to record a lecture, a mini lesson, send it home so students have control over the time, the place, and the pace of their learning. And then we would use class time for practice and application so teachers can really support learners as they're attempting to take that new learning and do something with it, which is typically when they hit a bump and they need help. Now, I think I don't want teachers to feel like you have to send video home with kids for it to be effective. In fact, the longer I spent in education, the more disillusioned I became with homework anyway. So I wanted to figure out, how do I pull video instruction into the classroom and make this really meaningful for learners? Because I do know that video, they can pause it, they can rewind it, they can watch it half a dozen times. I don't have to say it half a dozen times. They can add closed captions, they can slow down a YouTube video. So for me, there's still a really interesting place to use video in the classroom, again, to just free the teacher. So when teachers say like, hey, Catlin, when should I make a video versus when should I, run small group instruction? My answer is simple. Like, if you're going to say the same thing the same way to everybody, make a video. So as a high school English teacher, I kind of explained what a thesis statement was, where it went in your essay, how to structure one the same way to everybody. So I made a 6-minute video. But when it got into the weeds around like, how do you analyze a quote? That is way better for me to do in a small group where I can really be intentional about the grouping strategy, about the quotes I use with different learners as we're digging in and analyzing them. I know they're going to need different levels of support as we do that. So that would be much better in a small group differentiated mode. So that's kind of the guideline I share with teachers when they're like, I like this idea, but I don't know where to start with video.
Right. So in this model, everybody still is they're kind of doing the same thing around the same time, or is there some timing variations on this? Like how would a 90-minute block look with this model?
Yeah, well, it depends, because you can pull a video lesson into an online station in a station rotation. Or if you want to pull video into the class, you can almost create what is essentially a whole group rotation, right? Where, there's a pre-video activity because the video is online individual. I'm a big fan of the pre-video activity being collaborative and offline. Can we use it to create context, access prior knowledge, hook student interest, engage them in discussion to really set them up to be successful when they transition to the video. And then ideally, we're building a buffer of time around that video because students are in a classroom, right? They lose the control over the time and the place, but we want them to still have control over the pace. Like pause it, back it up a little bit if they miss something or they need to catch up on their notes. And then hopefully once they transition out of the video, which is going to happen at different paces, they have something they're moving into that challenges them to take what they heard and saw and learned in the video and do something with it. Now, what becomes tricky, and you and I talked about this a little bit when we were going through the blog post, is kids are going to self-pace at different rates. So some kids are going to come out of that video quickly and be ready for that follow-up activity. And then they might be done. So do we have a next steps protocol? Do we have a may-do list? Do we have extension activities that challenge them to go further? So I think a lot of times teachers are so scared of like, what if kids finish early or what if they pace more quickly? And I'm like, but that's a benefit. Let's just have a structure in place. So if that happens, they know what they need to do. Maybe they even, you have strong kids who self-pace really quickly and they grab a tutor lanyard off the side of your wall and they go and they support students who are kind of struggling with that practice and application. Like there's so many fun things we could have them do. It's just about thinking that through and having it ready.
And you've got some of those, I'm assuming those ideas are all in your book too. Some more suggestions for those types of things. Good. So in this model, there is a moment where, if somebody were to walk by the room, the kids are all basically plugged into devices for a period of time. But what they're not seeing from the outside is that this actually is part of a bigger picture that is actually differentiated and has a lot of student agency, basically.
Right. It's woven into this complete blended experience. And there were times, quite frankly, when I did use that 3 kind of part flipped approach with the pre-video, the video lesson, and then the kind of extend and apply, where, I had second language learners where I was like, instead of the video, I'm going to pull this group of 4 students and we're going to do this live. I'm going to work with them. So sometimes you'd see the majority of kids on a computer, and then you'd see me with a group that I just knew the video probably wasn't going to be enough, or there might be language in the video that made it hard for them to take in that information.
The pain point that you did not bring up that I'm thinking of now that all of this solves is it's the constant student absences and always trying to make up for and if you've got some stuff that's already packaged in either a video or some other format, you're not trying to figure out, how do I give this student the same experience that everybody else got yesterday?
I know. Yeah, absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Okay, so we have, just to review, we have gone through, I like to do this on the podcast for people that are on treadmills or whatever. We've got the station rotation model, the whole group rotation, the flipped classroom model, and then number 4 is what?
The playlist model, the playlist or individual rotation. And, just like you have a playlist on Spotify that has like a sequential order of songs, very similar in an educational playlist. It's just a sequence of learning activities that are put together in such a way that they're going to move learners to a desired result or outcome or learning objective. So, in a playlist, you might have some video instruction, you might have offline kind of learning activities, you might have online discussions. So all of those kind of individual kind of instructional strategies we use can find their way into the playlist. And I love the playlist model because on the outset, they're really manageable to differentiate. So for example, when I create a playlist or I'm working as a coach with a teacher working on a playlist, we'll kind of create that, what I consider like the middle of the road playlist, the one we think most students will be successful with. And then once we've built that out, and we almost always use a digital document or slide deck to create them, just go to File, make a copy, and then we'll usually work on like an advanced or next level version. And it might have less repeat instruction, fewer teacher check-ins. They might be working on a slightly different product to demonstrate their learning at the end of the playlist. Once we have that advanced version done, we go back to the middle of the road. We make a copy, and when we create a more scaffolded, supported version, a little more repeat instruction, more teacher check-ins, maybe more practice and review, and a slightly different product they're creating to demonstrate their learning. And then I always encourage teachers include, at least at a couple strategic moments in the playlist, what I call teacher check-ins or When I was a teacher, it was just Tucker time. It was like, this is your time with me. We're going to sit together. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to look at your formative assessment data. I'm going to ask you how it's going. Where are you feeling strong? Where do you need support? And then when we create these kind of additions to their playlist or modifications. So it was a really sustainable way to feel like I was personalizing their learning, because I couldn't know what they all needed at the outset. But as they were making their way through it, it became clear like, ooh, this student would benefit from sitting with this other student and talking about this part of it because this student's doing really well. Or maybe they need to log back in here and do some review and practice, or watch this video instruction again. So I love the playlist model. My only concern with that one is just it's really easy to have kids staring at the screen the whole time. So I always built in the check-ins and even offline activities that kind of force them to kind of work together off the computer. So you can create like pairs that work through their own playlist together, but they're paired up, or even a playlist team, so that when they hit an offline kind of moment, it's like, okay, is anybody else on my team ready for this? So that way it's not so isolating.
Yeah. That's a great idea. Okay. And we're going to have a example for people to look at if they're having trouble picturing. I think it's also great for kids to be able to see the big picture of like a unit of instruction, which it's a lot of times it's just kind of in the air and they don't really see where they're headed. So,
absolutely. Like we know why we're asking them to do what we're doing, but they don't really understand the trajectory of like, what are they doing and why necessarily.
Right. So just as we wrap up, is there anything else that you would want to say to teachers who are thinking about taking this on, for this year?
Yeah, I would love for teachers to really remember that in a classroom, we are the lead learner. We want students to see us trying new things, taking risks, failing occasionally, asking them for feedback, and iterating and improving. I know that is a vulnerable position to be in as an educator, but I think the more willing we are to lean into our own learning and take those risks and potentially fail and then try to improve, it makes it a lot less scary for students to do all those things in our classroom environments. And as you try, if you're willing to kind of try some of these things, just really include your students in a conversation about what do they feel is working well? What are they struggling with? What are they finding challenging? What recommendations would they, make for improving a particular model or strategy that we're using? Because they are ultimately the customers, and this is a learning community. And so not feeling like you have to do it all at once, it's like, get excited, think big, start small, right? And then just be willing to take those risks, and then also include those students in that conversation. I think that's the best way for us to keep learning and growing as educators.
Awesome. So the book is The Complete Guide to Blended Learning. If people want to find you online, where's the best place for them to go?
CatlinTucker.com. That's where I post a blog normally every week. It's my books, my courses, everything that they might want is there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this with us.
Absolutely. It was wonderful to connect with you.
You too. For links to Catlin's blog post, which includes visual examples of all 4 models and a link to her book, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 196. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.